everybody, my name is Hoi-Fei Mok. I am the Sustainability Manager at the City of San Leandro. So today I'll be talking a little bit about climate impacts within the city and just broadly in the Bay Area, as well as things we're working towards to reduce the climate impacts and things that you can do also as individuals and also in your organizations. So first I'll start off with something interactive. So if you can go, I've lost my chat function here. If you can go to this link here, just to, we'll be doing a couple of interactive polls. So if you go to this website, you should be able to answer the first poll. Okay, I'll just give it another minute for folks to answer. Looks like we did have pretty good representation from San Leandro, which is great. Thanks for that local repping. All right, great. Well, thanks everybody for answering this. Keep the poll handy. We'll be using this for a couple of different activities during the presentation. So there'll be different sorts of things happening. So still looks like we have a majority of folks in San Leandro, so this will be good. But a lot of what I'll be covering does apply regionally. So even if it's not geographically in San Leandro, you will still be able to get some of that applicability. So first part, I just wanted to make the connection between COVID and the climate crisis. So a lot of the conditions that allow the pandemic to be as widespread and terrifying as it is are really the same conditions that allow for the climate crisis. A lot of this is happening because we are very much in an interconnected world. We are mismanaging resources, and that has global impacts on folks. So both in the climate crisis and in the pandemic, it's often the first line communities that get hit first and worst in these kind of crises. People of color, folks who are living on the poverty line, people with disabilities, elders, and so on. So a lot of this both gives more reason to be more resilient and adaptive to changes that are coming. So what do we already know about the climate impacts? So first, I just have a thought exercise for y'all, and feel free to type your answer in the chat as we go. So think back to 2 years ago when we had the Paradise fires, when the town completely burnt down, and there were 2 weeks of poor air quality here in the Bay Area. Think about what that experience was like, how the smoke affected you and your family have felt. So for myself, that was a particularly anxiety-inducing time, just seeing the really visual impact of climate and the smoke in the air. It was very difficult to see, and it was particularly poignant that something that was happening a couple hundred miles away was affecting us here in the Bay Area, and it was really widespread. And there's a lot of health impacts that I was acutely aware of because a number of my friends had asthma and would be affected in that moment from the smoke, as well as younger children who would then be exposed to longer term impacts. So if you want to share your experience, then feel free to type that into the chat. We'll kind of skip the small group discussion verbally. In terms of how this connects to climate, so as folks may know, California does have a wildfire landscape naturally. There are set seasons and months where there are fires that burn. And indigenous folks and Native Americans knew that. They sited their settlements outside of those historic fire zones, and they knew how to do control burns and kind of manage that habitat. But as modern urban expansion seeded those fire zones, we keep building and we keep growing our population. We've now built into where there are high fire risks. So if you live in San Leandro, Bay Vista, that is a high fire zone right next to the Chabot Regional Park. So as climate change intensifies, we see temperatures increase. We see drought becoming longer and longer. Both of those and other effects cause more intense and more frequent wildfires. So we're seeing that wildfire seasons are now starting earlier in May and June, going all the way out to December or November. The fires themselves also burn longer. In addition to that, and all that is due to the climate change. So in addition to that, we're not only burning natural wood materials, but we're also burning cities as well. So cars, industrial materials, plastics, all of this increases the toxicity of the smoke that we are inhaling, and a lot of that has a really damaging health impacts long term. So if you are still a young person, your lungs are still developing. So if you get those particulate materials inside this bloodstream, this will cause more aggravation of asthma, of other respiratory diseases, and so on. So that's also why we keep monitoring the particulate matter concentration levels. So when you see these maps, that's what we are looking out for. So some of the impacts that we see from these climate events really have to do with the immediate impacts of the smoke and folks who may need healthcare access during this time. So you may have seen that your family had to, change the way that they're going about their day to make sure that, you were kept inside, or that maybe you're caring for elders or other folks in your family who needed to be inside, or maybe you had younger siblings who needed to be kept from their regular daycare location, and so on. So there's a lot of changes to the day-to-day that they may be impacted by this need. Some folks don't always have the choice to be inside where they can be safe from the smoke. So these folks include agricultural workers, maintenance workers, construction workers, landscapers, people who are unhoused, and so on. So a lot of these folks, they in theory are protected by employment guidelines that force the employer to provide masks and so on, but a lot of these times, again, these guidelines are not enforced, and a lot of these folks then are more vulnerable to the health impacts of smoke. So looking further on, we may see other kind of indirect impacts where if agricultural workers can't be kept safe during the smoke and working outside, this may cause disruptions to our food supply. If those agricultural workers can't actually be outside picking the food, we may see increases in food prices. So that has other kind of downstream impacts. So this also say, there are a lot of different direct and indirect causes to the climate events. Another example of that is the power shutoff. So we just experienced that last year with the first PSPS event, as they're called. This occurred because PG&E and the utilities were found responsible for a number of the wildfires due to a lack of the maintenance, clearing of the brush around the power lines, which then triggered fires during hot and windy days. So because it is very expensive and laborious for them to try and rehaul the whole system, one of the stopgap measures that they took was to try and shut off the power during these potential wildfire days. So that also has another whole slew of potential impacts where, businesses and schools and facilities were shut down because they didn't have power. There's a lot of uncertainty as to when and where this happened, and there's a lot of changes to the routine in managing your daycare, your elder care, and so on. Folks who are already living on the cusp of poverty, they might not be able to afford losing groceries for a whole week. Some of the predictions for losing the power up in the Marin County area or Sonoma area was for a whole week. So this, again, has really devastating impacts for families who can't necessarily manage for these type of situations. Another particularly precarious situation are for folks who depend on electricity for medical or mobility devices and equipment. So in one case, a man did die after the power shut off because they weren't able to get any sort of backup power to him, and he was unable to use one of his medical devices. So this is really real consequences for folks that have to be addressed. And again, all this stems from a system that has been disrupted by climate change. So this is something that is new, and we're still trying to figure out the best ways to address. So a lot of what I just covered for the wildfire and the PSPS, we can do the same thing and think about other climate impacts. So I'll just kind of give an overview of things that are happening locally and things that we know that we also have to be preparing for. So this particular graph here shows the number of projected extreme heat days in San Leandro, where extreme heat day is any day above 90 degrees. We have 3 different lines here, which represent different climate forecast models. The red line kind of represents the most aggressive climate modeling, where we aren't doing quite as much to address climate change. That goes up to about 40 or 42 degrees days of extreme heat days per year. And kind of the more moderate yellow line model suggests that there will only be around less than 5 annual days above 90 degrees. So even in my lifetime, having grown up here in San Leandro, I've seen an increase in the number of heat waves and extreme heat days in San Leandro. So this is something that's happening in our lifetime. And not something that's, this projected future is actually happening now. So again, this is something that we have to be preparing for and really making folks more resilient and being able to adapt to those hot days. This is another example of future impacts, the sea level rise. So this map shows one of the models for rising sea levels at 72 inches above sea level. So everywhere that you see in blue is where it is expected to flood. All the different icons represent important sites that may be impacted. So anything that could include restaurants, schools, industrial hazard sites where you could leak, hazardous materials due to the flooding, the wastewater treatment plant where, if that gets impacted, you might get sewage coming out of your toilet and so on. So there's a lot of things that we as a city need to be aware of so that we can come up with the appropriate strategies to address. So all this information is covered in what we call the vulnerability assessment so that we can really identify where the city's vulnerabilities are and trying to work with the appropriate parties to come up with those strategies. This is just another map showing some of the flooding. You see in blue some of the projections for the sea level rise. The lighter blue and the purple show where there would be a groundwater flooding if there's a lot of extreme storms and so on. So you see that some of the areas in San Leandro specifically could potentially flood as well. Up at the top right, you'll see where there are the high fire risk zones. So a lot of that is the Lake Chabot Regional Park area. Some of it does come into the city of San Leandro specifically, but again, like a lot of that brush area would be considered a high fire risk zone. And so similar maps can be drawn for other jurisdictions if you don't live in San Leandro. Sea level rise in particular is something that Visa region are concerned about, and there's a lot of collaboration around that. Wildfire also specifically is something that a lot of us in California are acutely aware of, given the last couple of years. So again, there's a lot of collaboration around the specific fires, the smoke, the power shutoffs, and so on. So happy to dive into that if you have questions about other jurisdictions. These are just a couple of photos of some of the flooding that you'll see, and this has happened in the last couple of years. The above photo on the right shows flooding in the Sonoma area. The photo on the bottom right is from the San Jose area. You'll see San Francisco here, some of the water is coming up onto the road. So this is just to show, the flooding and the storms is happening now. And we are seeing the impacts and trying to, come up with the best solutions. So these roads aren't designed to be underwater for this long. So there's going to be a lot of maintenance costs that come with it. And so we need to make sure that, we don't have roads that are blocking the transportation of various resources and emergency personnel if there really was, a giant flood. Some of the residential homes, if they do get flooded, that also has long-term impacts for folks. So mold can occur if you don't get all the water out of your home, and mold definitely has long-term health consequences. Can get people really sick if they're living in those kind of conditions. So both of these things, both in the public sphere and on the private sphere, are things that we need to be concerned about because it's happening now. This particular graph just shows some of the consequences on the health level. I mentioned a couple of those in terms of the asthma from air pollution and smoke. We have a number of heat-related illnesses if we have folks that are exposed to extreme heat. The pandemic is an example of a vector disease that has spread because we are just living very, very close to nature. And with climate change, if more mosquitoes and other disease-carrying animals are having their habitats increase because of climate change, we will see more diseases like Lyme disease, West Nile disease, and so on. And Lyme disease in particular has already increased across the U.S. In the last couple of years. So we are already kind of seeing that. So this just kind of gives an example of some of the things, again, both direct and indirect things that are related to climate events, and some of the things that we'll have to be looking at. So I'll just kind of pause there and we can go back to the link. So if you can go to your Poll EV link here. This is just an activity to kind of show, how would you rank climate change in terms of urgency and importance? So if you think that climate change is really something that is urgent, you put it closer to the right side on the x-axis. If you think that climate change is something that is an important issue, you put it closer to the top for the y-axis. So again, you can go to Poll EV Resilient Sand 839, and you can fill in your answer here. Okay. All right. Well, thanks folks for filling it out. We have an interesting spread. One person who thinks that it's not urgent, but still important, and most of the other folks who think it's somewhat urgent and somewhat important. So thanks for doing that. So now I'll just pop back up to our presentation here. So that kind of just gives the overview for things that we're anticipating in terms of the impacts. So now I want to kind of give some of where we're hoping to go to in addressing some of these things. So a lot of what I'm about to share comes from the Vision for Just Transition, which comes out of labor organizing and environmental justice organizing. It really just describes a transition to a world that is actually sustainable and equitable for all people. So really moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, to funding public transit, to having sustainable local food, and homes for all. So a lot of this really is a people-centered approach that prioritizes the frontline communities that will be impacted first and worst by climate change. People of color, low-income communities, elders, indigenous folks, youth. I show a photo of my family here. You know, all of us have lived or worked in San Diego at some point or another. So I'm really thinking about those folks, my family and the communities that will be impacted by climate change, and really trying to come up with projects that put the well-being of people first. So some of the things that we can be working towards is really just having more walkable and bikeable neighborhoods. I think all of us, since the start of shelter in place, we probably noticed that, you know, the air is cleaner because we don't have cars driving around. We don't have to be sitting in traffic. And being able to just really be local, being able to walk to everything that we need in terms of school, jobs, all of our essential needs, that saves us a lot of time in terms of not having to sit in a car all day. So that's one thing that we could be working towards. I think all of us, again, have really realized how important health is. So wanting to center that both in the health of individuals and also the type of materials that we're using for homes, and really making sure that that is sustainable and efficient and not going to contribute to the detriment of our individual health and the health of the planet. A lot of that stems from being able to have access to clean energy, clean water, clean food, clean air. Again, this has to do with the health of our individuals, making sure that we're not eating and consuming things that are bad for us, as well as, you know, not over extracting, using bad materials from the earth as well. There's also a huge amount of innovation and opportunity from green jobs and careers right now. So there's a lot of new exploration in terms of renewable energy, just as well as new ways of doing things in terms of transportation or tech. So hopefully, as you mature and get into the workforce, you're able to capture some of those opportunities. There's also a cost savings aspect to it. So we know that there are going to be disasters that are coming down the road. So how can we make sure that we are doing the things up front to keep us safe, so that we're not having to spend more after a disaster has happened. So really making sure that we can save on some of those things up front. So kind of on the same lines, so we know that, you know, there is going to be a wildfire season that gets bigger and bigger every year. So how can we prepare our communities and individuals to be resilient in the wildfire smoke, in the power shutoffs, in those storms and flooding, and not be caught off guard during those incidences. We also want to make sure that we are conserving our natural spaces. There's a lot of earth that is around, and we're not the only species that is sharing this planet. So really want to make sure that we are conserving both those spaces for those other species that we share this earth with, and also for our own well-being as well, as many of us do like to go out into nature. There's also an aspect of trying to build a community power. So a lot of what we do in terms of the planning process is we be able to reach out to the community and make sure that they are involved in decision making. Democracy, participatory democracy is an ideal that we can actually achieve in local government. Something that we may not necessarily see on a larger scale, but at the local government level, you do actually have an ability to sit on boards, to sit on committees, to influence what these city plans look like. So that has a lot to do with what you think we should be addressing in terms of all these different impacts. There's not one necessarily right answer. So we really want to make sure that we are consulting with all the different groups that are going to be impacted by this. So we'll pop back out to the link here. So if you go back to Pole EV Resilient SAN 839, and just type in 3 words that resonated with you from that vision of community resilience. What things that really speak out to you? What do you think that we should be working towards when we think about community resilience? So feel free to type in your answers now. All right, so we have a couple of words on here. Consideration, unity, aware, present, proactive, together. Feel free to continue typing in your answers. Want to maybe give it another minute or so for folks. Being mindful. There's a interesting spread of wanting to take action and really thinking about doing this together. I think that's an important thing to highlight. Feel free to continue typing in your answers if you have any. So we will jump back out to the presentation and just chat a little bit about what folks can do about this as individuals. So I wanted to highlight just this framework from Blueprint Generation. You can look into one of the materials on this link here. So this really just shows the framework for the just transition, moving away from the extractive economy to the regenerative economy. And they give 5 different pillars: resources, work, purpose, worldview, and governance. I'm not going to go into too much detail into this, but just kind of wanted to highlight that a lot of what climate change is happening at a systemic level. And typically, I don't like to make the association too strongly for individuals to say that whatever that you're doing is going to solve climate change, because it's not. A lot of these things are built into a system of extraction, of capitalism, of militarism, a system that exploits people, that continues to push consumerism and colonialism in order to enclose wealth and power. That is the reason why we have climate change. The Just Transition Framework kind of boils it down a little bit more. So I definitely encourage you to look at these materials and explore more. But that being said, even though things are happening at a very high level, it doesn't mean that you can't take action on an individual basis. Definitely those things are still useful. They're just not going to solve climate change. So I just want to make that really clear. Nothing that we do as individuals is necessarily going to change the entire system, but it can still make a difference in your day-to-day world, as well as any organizations that you work with. So I just want to make that distinction. So particularly if you are working in a business or organization who hasn't made any of these changes already, a lot of these things have a lot of other benefits to both the health of individuals, their cost savings, and so on. Cost savings is a very, very high co-benefit for making some of these changes. So, for example, if your organization hasn't already become energy efficient, there's a lot of energy savings that you could get from that. Similarly, if your organization is still using pen and paper, hasn't gone digital, you could save a lot of money on paper just by switching over to computers and digital platform. So there's a lot of things in purchasing, trying to make sure that your organization's operations are more streamlined and not, wasting materials. You could get a lot of savings from there. A work from home policy also could make employees more efficient. They're not having to spend a lot of time in your commute or having to be too far away from their family. And really formalizing that, especially now that we've lived it for a couple of months, could be beneficial again to the overall operations of your organization. And then on a similar vein, thinking about having water efficient appliances and landscaping if you do have physical site that you irrigate, and making sure that you're not overwatering and so on. So if you want more information about these specific type of changes and what else is suggested, there is a program called the Green Business California program. The link is available down below. And there is a coordinator for every county that helps walk you through how to make these changes, and you can actually become certified as a green business. So that might be something that your employer could be interested in doing. You would get recognition for the things that you've done, and also financial support for doing other kind of changes. So feel free to explore the Green Business website there. On an individual basis, there's also a number of things that you can do. So this comes from the GoGreen.org website, which is our San Leandro specific platform. I'll just kind of jump into the website here to show you. So for example, some of the things that you can do could be to choose buying green electricity and not having to install solar panels, eating lower down the carbon food chain and not having to have so much meat. You could install a electric heat pump heater, use more public transit, replace your lawn, and so on. So this particular website kind of has a number of different suggestions for things that people can do on an individual basis. And all of these do have cost savings to them. So this is the icon that represents how much money that you save. In this particular example is if you work from home, you'd probably save around $990 a year just from the commute itself. And this particular points here kind of represents how much greenhouse gas emissions you could save globally if you did that. So if you're ever interested in kind of looking at more of the individual actions, you can always go to gogreen.sl.org/actions and kind of show some of these things that way. And yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. And I think now we can jump to questions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself or pop into the chat.
Hey Faye, I have a question.
Yes.
What makes you want to present on this topic? Like, what do you want to do to change the world with it? In like a sentence.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. Um, I mean, climate change is my life work. I guess you can say that. I think that a lot of the issues that we see in the world are connected to climate in some way. For example, a lot of the civil unrest in Syria, for example, came from the drought that happened. And so we see kind of the aggregation of folks because of destabilization of society from that. So I see this as something that affects all aspects of life, and is a very, very big issue that needs to be addressed, because if we don't have a planet to live on, then it doesn't really matter, right? So I think it's really important that, we are both looking at immediate things that are happening to the most vulnerable communities, as well as trying to prevent future disasters that are going to be happening. So that's part of why I do this work, and also why I try to educate folks on things that are happening, and ways that they can understand the systems for why it's happening, and also ways that they can plug in.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Faye, I do want to say I really like your background, and you do
Thank
have a
you.
question.
I painted it.
We'll have to talk about that more another time. But
Yeah.
You have a question.
Yeah. How did I get started in sustainability? I think the very first time I started thinking about it, I was maybe in elementary school, and then somebody was talking to me about recycling. So that was kind of my very first introduction to environmental kind of work. And then in graduate school, I ended up getting my PhD in environmental science, and kind of got the very rigorous research and science foundation for what I do. And then I followed that with the AmeriCorps Fellowship, which placed me at the city of city of Emeryville, excuse me, where I was able to help them develop their climate action plan. So it was a very hands-on program called Civic Spark, if anybody is ready at that point. It's a post-college program where you can get hands-on experience doing climate policy work. So I was able to work with City of Emeryville to develop the climate action plan. So that introduced me to kind of the more policy aspects, really able to apply the scientific knowledge that I had. Also, at the same time, I've been doing a lot of community organizing around climate justice and social justice, because, again, because the climate crisis is going to be impacting certain communities disproportionately, it's very important that we include equity in the plans that we introduce, and also in the frameworks for moving forward. So I do a lot of community organizing, relationship building with different community-based organizations. This particular mural here is actually to remind myself that the vision for climate resilience is really community-centered and heart-centered. So it's a helpful reminder to, if I'm getting too caught up in kind of the day-to-day work, that's the bigger picture that I'm working towards. So that's kind of how I got into it. All right. Well, so Sophia shared that They were helping to raise money for communities hit hardest by Paradise Fires a few years ago, so they wanted to do more in reducing carbon emissions. So yeah, thank you for doing that important work. It's very much needed to help with the recovery aspects. Anybody else who wants to share? Yeah. So Bennett said that their carbon footprint is going to be increasing by flying back and forth to college in the East Coast. So wanting to know how to compensate for that increase in other aspects of your life. So yeah, it's good to be aware of that. And definitely there's a lot of ways. You can feel free to check out the Go Green website and see some of those potential strategies. All right, well, if it looks like there's no other folks who want to share, just want to thank everybody for your time and letting me present to you all. I think I've shared the slides with the PilotCity team, so they are available if you want to go back to reference anything. And I definitely encourage everybody to explore some of the links that I've shared. And feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or things that you want to chat about. So thanks very much.